The cypress trees stood like dark sentinels in the murky water, their roots twisted and gnarled beneath the surface. Gideon Hale wiped the sweat from his brow with a mud-stained sleeve and looked back at his wife, Lydia, who sat perched on a fallen log with their last sack of cornmeal clutched in her lap. It was late September 1889, and the Louisiana heat still pressed down on them like a wet blanket, even this close to the Atchafalaya Basin. They'd come here 3 months ago with hope burning bright and a land claim that promised fertile ground. What they'd found instead was swamp, endless, unforgiving swamp that swallowed their seeds, rotted their first shelter, and turned every step into a battle against sucking mud. "Gideon, we can't keep going like this," Lydia called out, her voice steady but tired. She was 27, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that had seen too many disappointments lately. "That cornmeal won't last us 2 weeks." He knew she was right. At 34, Gideon had worked hard ground before, Wyoming prairie, Nebraska plains, but nothing had prepared him for this waterlogged wilderness. Their mule, Jasper, stood knee-deep in black water ahead, refusing to move another step. The animal's stubbornness had saved them more than once, and Gideon had learned to trust it. "Come on, boy," Gideon coaxed, wading forward through the muck. "Just a little further, and we'll find solid ground." But Jasper planted his hooves and brayed, his front legs sinking deeper into the mud. Gideon reached for the bridle, and that's when he saw it. A glint of something dark and metallic beneath the churned-up sediment where Jasper's hoof had broken through. "Lydia, bring the shovel." She set down the cornmeal carefully, wrapping it in oilcloth to keep it dry, then picked her way across the half-submerged logs they'd laid down as a makeshift path. When she reached him, Gideon was already on his knees in the water, digging with his bare hands around whatever Jasper had uncovered. "What is it?" she asked, handing him the shovel. "Iron. Heavy iron." He worked the shovel carefully around the object, feeling the resistance of something large and solid. "Feels like a corner of something." They worked together as the afternoon light began to fade, Gideon digging while Lydia hauled away buckets of mud. Slowly, impossibly, the shape emerged from beneath the cypress roots, a iron safe, locked tight and covered in decades of rust and sediment. Gideon ran his hand along the top of the safe, tracing the outline of a tarnished brass plate barely visible beneath the corrosion. "This didn't fall here yesterday," he said quietly. "Look at how deep those roots grew around it." Lydia knelt beside him, her skirt soaking through in the cold water. "How long do you think it's been down here?" 10 years, maybe 20. Could be from before the war." He tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The lock mechanism was seized solid with rust and packed mud. "We need to get it out of here before the water rises again." They worked until full dark, using the mule and a system of ropes to drag the safe inch by inch through the mud toward higher ground. Jasper strained against the weight, his hooves slipping on the wet earth, but Gideon kept him steady with a firm hand and patient words. By the time they hauled it onto the dry patch near their tent, both of them were covered head to toe in black swamp muck, exhausted and shivering in the November cold. Lydia built up the fire while Gideon examined the safe more closely by lamplight. It was smaller than a steamer trunk, but built like a fortress. Thick iron plates riveted together, with a combination lock that had long since corroded into uselessness. "We'll have to break it open," he said, "but carefully. If there's anything inside worth saving, I don't want to ruin it." She brought him a tin cup of hot coffee, and he wrapped his cold hands around it gratefully. "What do you think is in there?" "Could be nothing. Could be someone's life savings, lost when a boat went down." He met her eyes across the firelight. Could be enough to get us through the winter. They didn't speak the larger hope aloud, that it might be enough to buy them out of this swamp entirely, to start over on solid ground where crops could actually grow. But it hung between them in the silence, fragile as morning frost. The next day, Gideon rode into the nearest settlement, a struggling cluster of buildings called Cypress Landing, and returned with a borrowed sledgehammer and cold chisel. He also brought news. Asked around careful-like about any lost cargo or missing safes. Nobody's claimed anything like this in living memory. Harbor Master said if it's been down there since before 75, it's legally abandoned property. Lydia felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of worry she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. So, whatever's inside is ours, Gideon finished, if we can get it open. They worked in shifts over the next 3 days, taking turns with the chisel, while the other kept watch and brought water. The iron was old but stubborn, its seams rusted shut by decades underwater. Gideon's hands blistered, then bled, then calloused over. Lydia wrapped them each night with strips torn from her one spare petticoat, boiled clean in creek water. On the morning of the 4th day, something gave. A grinding crack echoed across the clearing as the lock mechanism finally surrendered. Gideon set down the sledgehammer, his arms trembling from exhaustion. Lydia knelt beside him as he worked his fingers under the lid and lifted. The hinges screamed, then silence. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept the worst of the water out, were stacks of silver coins. Not a fortune by city standards, but more money than either of them had seen in one place in their entire lives. Beneath the coins lay something else, thick packets of paper, official-looking, sealed with wax that had partially melted and reformed. Gideon lifted one carefully. The ink had run in places, but the words were still legible. Land certificates, issued by the state of Louisiana in 1873, never claimed, never registered. And tucked in the very bottom, wrapped in rotting velvet, a brass compass with a cracked glass face and a single ruby set into its housing. Lydia's hand shook as she touched the edge of one certificate. How much land? Gideon squinted at the faded script, his lips moving as he read. This one's for 80 acres. This one, 120. He looked up at her, his face pale beneath the dirt and sweat. Lydia, there's 6 of them here. She did the arithmetic in her head, hardly daring to believe it. That's over 500 acres. If the claims are still valid, Gideon said carefully, if nobody else filed on them in the meantime. But even as he spoke, Lydia could see the hope kindling in his eyes, the same hope that was rising in her own chest like floodwater, unstoppable and terrifying and impossibly bright. They sat together in the mud beside the open safe, surrounded by the wreckage of someone else's dreams, holding the possibility of their own. They carried the safe back to the cabin in pieces. First the silver, wrapped in Lydia's spare apron, then the land certificates sealed in oilcloth, Gideon cut from their wagon cover, and finally the compass, which Lydia tucked into her bodice where it rested cold against her heart. The mule, freed from the mud at last, followed them with its head low, too exhausted to protest. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had dropped below the cypress canopy, and the swamp had gone dark and loud with frogs. Inside, Gideon lit their last good candle and spread the certificates across the table. Lydia stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder, reading over the faded ink. The claims were dated 1871 and 1872, 17 and 18 years old. Some bore the names of men she'd never heard of. Others had no names at all, only parcel numbers and township coordinates. We'll need to go to the land office in Baton Rouge, Gideon said quietly. See if these are still open. That's 3 days' travel, Lydia said. Maybe 4, if the roads are bad. We don't have the money for travel. Gideon's voice was flat. We don't have money for anything. Lydia looked at the silver stacked on the table, 43 coins in all, each one stamped with an eagle and a date from before she was born. We do now, she said. Gideon turned to look at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then he nodded, slow and deliberate. We take 10 coins, he said. Enough for travel, enough for filing fees if the claims are good, and enough for supplies to get us through till harvest. The rest we bury. Where? Somewhere dry, Gideon said, and despite everything, Lydia almost smiled. They worked by candlelight, wrapping the remaining silver in canvas and sealing it with pine tar. Gideon buried it beneath the hearthstone, while Lydia kept watch at the window, though there was no one for miles to see. When it was done, they sat together at the table, the land certificates between them, and ate the last of the cornmeal as a cold mush with no salt. If the claims are good, Lydia said softly, we could have a real house on high ground. We could have cattle, Gideon said, a barn, a smokehouse, a garden that doesn't flood. They looked at each other in the candlelight, and Lydia saw in his face the same fragile, ferocious thing she felt in her own chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but the shape of it, the possibility. We leave at first light, Gideon said. Lydia nodded. At first light. They woke before dawn to the sound of rain drumming on the cabin roof. Gideon stood at the door, watching water sheet off the eaves, and felt his stomach tighten. The trail to Thibodeau was barely passable in dry weather. In rain, it would be a ribbon of mud through standing water, every low spot a trap. But they had no choice. The land office was only open 3 days a week, and if they missed this window, it would be another 5 days before they could try again. 5 days they couldn't afford. Lydia wrapped the land certificates in oilcloth, then wrapped that bundle in a second layer, tying it with waxed cord. She tucked it inside Gideon's coat, against his ribs, where it would stay dry even if he fell. They ate nothing. There was nothing left to eat, and stepped out into the gray morning with the mule already harnessed to the empty wagon. The animal's ribs showed through its hide, but its eyes were clear, and it pulled without complaint. The trail was worse than Gideon had imagined. Within a mile, the wagon wheels sank to the hubs, and he had to climb down and push from behind while Lydia coaxed the mule forward. Mud sucked at his boots. Water soaked through his trousers. His hands were numb, his shoulders burning, but he kept pushing. Lydia never looked back. She kept her voice low and steady, speaking to the mule the way she spoke to him on the worst nights. Calm, certain, as if there were no other outcome possible. By midday, they reached the first dry road, a raised shell path that led through pine woods toward town. Gideon climbed back onto the wagon seat, shaking with cold and exhaustion. Lydia handed him a rag to wipe his face, and he saw that her hands were shaking too. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that wasn't already understood. Thibodeau appeared through the trees just after 2 o'clock, a scatter of wooden buildings, a church steeple, the land office with its painted sign. Gideon pulled the wagon to a stop in front of it and sat for a moment, staring at the door. Lydia touched his arm. Go, she said quietly. He nodded, pulled the oilcloth bundle from inside his coat and stepped down into the mud. His legs felt like water. His heart hammered in his chest. He walked to the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The land office was warm and smelled of ink and old paper. A clerk sat behind a tall desk, scratching entries into a ledger. He looked up when Gideon entered, his eyes moving from Gideon's mud-streaked coat to his worn boots. "Help you?" he asked, his tone flat. Gideon stepped forward and set the oilcloth bundle on the counter. His hands were still trembling. "I need to speak with someone about a legal matter," he said. "Something we found on our property." The clerk's expression didn't change. "Found what?" Gideon unwrapped the bundle slowly, revealing the land notes, the sealed packets of silver, and the jeweled compass. The clerk's pen stopped moving. He stared at the items for a long moment, then stood and disappeared through a door at the back of the room. Gideon waited, his pulse loud in his ears. He could hear voices behind the door, low, urgent. Then footsteps. A man in a dark suit emerged, older, with silver hair and sharp eyes. He introduced himself as Mr. Beaumont, the land agent. He studied the items on the counter without touching them, then looked at Gideon. "Where did you find these?" Gideon told him. "The swamp, the cypress tree, the iron safe buried in the mud." He kept his voice steady, though his throat was dry. Beaumont listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When Gideon finished, Beaumont picked up one of the land notes and held it to the light. "This is from the Crescent Bell," he said quietly. "Steamboat that went down in the spring flood of 1871. 18 years ago. Cargo was never recovered." He set the note down and looked at Gideon. "You're saying this was on your land?" "Yes, sir. We filed our claim last year, 20 acres along the basin edge." Beaumont nodded slowly. He examined the other documents, the silver packets, the compass. Then he turned and pulled a thick ledger from a shelf behind him. He flipped through the pages, running his finger down columns of names and dates. Finally, he stopped. The Crescent Bell was declared a total loss. Cargo abandoned under territorial salvage law. If you found it on claimed land, and it's been more than 15 years. He looked up. "It's yours." Gideon felt the floor tilt beneath him. He gripped the edge of the counter. "You're certain?" "I'll need to file a report with the territorial office in Baton Rouge. But yes, legally, it's yours." Beaumont closed the ledger. "How much silver are we talking about?" "Enough," Gideon said quietly. "Enough to buy better land, build a real house." Beaumont studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll draw up the paperwork. Come back Monday. Bring your wife. You'll both need to sign." Gideon walked out of the land office in a daze. Lydia was still on the wagon, her face pale and tight with worry. When she saw him, she stood. "Well?" He climbed up beside her and took her hands. "It's ours," he said. "All of it. Legal and clear." Lydia's breath caught. For a moment, she just stared at him, her eyes searching his face as if she couldn't believe what she'd heard. Then her hands tightened around his, and she let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Legal?" she whispered. "Truly?" "Beaumont's filing the paperwork. We sign on Monday." He pulled her close, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, trembling. They sat like that for a long time, the wagon creaking beneath them, the street bustling around them, neither one able to speak. That night, back in the cabin, they spread the land notes across the table and studied them by lamplight. One parcel was 20 acres of high ground just north of the basin, dry, wooded, with a spring-fed creek running through it. Another was a narrow strip along the old river road, good for access. The third was swampland, but it bordered a cypress stand that could be harvested for timber. "We could sell two and keep the high ground," Lydia said, tracing the boundary lines with her finger. "Build there, plant an orchard, maybe keep chickens." Gideon nodded slowly. Or we keep all three. Use the timber rights to pay for the house. Lease the road parcel to a freight company. She looked up at him, surprised. You've been thinking about this. I haven't stopped thinking about it since we opened that safe. They talked late into the night, their voices low and careful, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile hope they were building. They talked about raised foundations and cypress shingles, about a root cellar dug into dry clay, about a barn with a loft and a garden plot fenced high enough to keep out the deer. They talked about things they hadn't dared to dream of in years. On Monday, they returned to the land office. Beaumont had the documents ready: transfer of salvage rights, affidavit of discovery, deed registration for the high ground parcel. Lydia signed her name in careful, steady script. Gideon signed beside her. Beaumont stamped the papers, folded them, and handed them over. Congratulations, he said. You're landowners now. Outside, Gideon tucked the papers inside his coat and helped Lydia onto the wagon. She was quiet as they rolled out of town, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze distant. What are you thinking? He asked. She turned to him, and there were tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. I'm thinking we're going to make it, she said. I'm thinking we're finally going to make it. They drove back through the afternoon heat, the wagon creaking beneath them, the papers pressed safe against Gideon's chest. The swamp stretched out on either side of the road, dark and still, but it didn't feel threatening anymore. It felt like something they'd conquered, something they'd survived. When they reached the cabin, Gideon unhitched the mule, and Lydia went inside to start supper. But neither of them could settle. They kept glancing at each other, smiling for no reason, touching the folded deed as if to make sure it was real. That night, they sat outside on the porch steps, watching fireflies drift over the water. Gideon had his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. We should start clearing the high ground next week, he said quietly. Get the trees marked, figure out where the house will sit. Lydia nodded. And we'll need to order lumber, good cypress planks, none of that green pine that warps in the wet. He smiled. You've been thinking about this. Every day, she said. Every single day. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the frogs and the distant call of a heron. Then Lydia spoke again, her voice softer now. I was so scared, Gideon. When we first came here, when the mule got stuck and we had nothing left, I thought we'd made a terrible mistake. He tightened his arm around her. I was scared too, but you didn't show it. I didn't want you to lose hope. She turned to look at him, her eyes bright in the dim light. I never lost hope in you, she said, not once. He kissed the top of her head, his throat tight. We did this together, he said. Every bit of it. She nodded, and they sat there until the stars came out, holding each other in the warm Louisiana night. The next morning, they began. Gideon took the wagon out to the high ground parcel and walked the property line, counting paces, marking trees with a hatchet. Lydia stayed behind to tend the garden and sort through their supplies, making lists of what they'd need: nails, rope, a new saw, seed for next spring's planting. By midday, Gideon returned with a rough map sketched on a piece of bark. He spread it out on the table, and they studied it together, tracing the shape of their future home with their fingers. They decided to build on the eastern edge of the parcel, where the ground rose highest, and a stand of young pines offered windbreak from the Gulf storms. Gideon marked the corners with stakes and twine, laying out a cabin 20 feet by 16, with space for a loft and a stone hearth on the north wall. Lydia walked the outline with him, imagining where the table would sit, where the bed would go, where light would fall through the windows in the morning. It felt real now, solid, like something they could hold on to. The first load of cypress lumber arrived 3 days later, hauled in by a man named Thibault, who ran a small mill near Bayou Sorrel. He was a quiet man with calloused hands and a sharp eye for timber. Gideon paid him in silver coins from the safe, counting them out carefully, while Lydia watched from the wagon seat. Thibault nodded his thanks, asked no questions, and promised to bring another load by the end of the week. "You picked good land," he said, glancing at the high ground. "Dry as you'll find this close to the basin." Gideon shook his hand, and Thibault drove off, his wagon creaking under the weight of empty barrels. They spent the next 2 weeks clearing brush, digging post holes, and setting the foundation stones. The work was slow and brutal in the heat, but they moved with purpose, each task bringing them closer to something permanent. Lydia mixed mud and moss for chinking, her hands stained brown by the end of each day. Gideon cut notches into the logs, fitting them together with the patience of a man who knew there would be no second chance. They worked from dawn until the light failed, then ate cold cornbread and beans by lantern light, too tired to speak but content in the silence. By late October, the walls were up. The cabin stood square and sturdy, its cypress logs still pale and raw, smelling of sap and swamp water. Gideon climbed onto the roof frame and looked out over the land, the basin stretching dark and endless to the south, the high ground solid beneath him. Lydia stood below, shading her eyes, watching him. "It's ours," he called down, his voice carrying across the clearing. She smiled, her face flushed from the work, and nodded. "It's ours," she said back. That night, they slept inside the cabin for the first time, on a bed of pine boughs spread across the dirt floor. The walls smelled of fresh-cut wood, and the stars showed through the open roof beams. Lydia lay with her head on Gideon's chest, listening to his heartbeat, feeling the weight of everything they'd built pressing down around them like a promise. By November, the roof was shingled with split cypress shakes, overlapped tight to shed the rain. Gideon built a stone hearth at the north wall, hauling flat rocks from the creek bed and setting them with clay mortar mixed from basin mud. The chimney rose slow and careful, each stone tested for balance, the flue lined with fire-hardened clay. Lydia whitewashed the inside walls with lime they'd traded for in town, brushing it on in long, even strokes until the cabin glowed pale and clean in the afternoon light. They built a loft for storage, a ladder of pegged rungs leading up to the beams. Beneath the floorboards, Gideon dug a root cellar, lining it with stone and fitting a trapdoor flush with the planks. It stayed cool even when the air outside turned heavy and damp. The land notes they'd found in the safe gave them claim to a second parcel, a narrow strip of high ground running east along the ridge. Gideon walked it in early December, pacing off the boundaries, marking the corners with stacked stones. The soil there was darker, less sandy, good for planting. He cleared a 1/4 acre by hand, pulling stumps with the mule and a chain, burning the brush in long, smoldering piles. Lydia helped him turn the soil, working a spade between the roots, her hands blistered and raw by evening. They didn't talk much while they worked, but the rhythm between them was easy, each knowing when to rest, when to push, when to step back and let the other lead. In town, people had started to notice. The Hales were building something real, something that would last. A man named Thibault, who ran the mill, offered Gideon work cutting lumber on shares. Another family, the Broussards, invited them to Sunday supper, a simple meal of rice and beans and cornbread served on a plank table under the trees. Lydia brought preserves she'd put up from wild plums, and the Broussard children ate them with their fingers, grinning. It felt good to be part of something larger than just the two of them, to be seen not as drifters or strangers, but as neighbors. By Christmas, the cabin had a door that latched, windows with real glass panes, and a table Gideon had built from leftover planks. Lydia sewed curtains from flour sacking, dyeing them pale yellow with onion skins. They had no tree, no decorations, but on Christmas Eve they lit candles in the windows and sat by the fire, the warmth spreading through the room like a blessing. Gideon reached for her hand across the table, his fingers rough and warm. "We made it," he said quietly. "We're still here." Lydia nodded, her throat tight. They had come so close to losing everything, to being swallowed by the swamp or broken by hunger. But they had held on, and now they had something solid beneath them, something that felt like the beginning of a real life. The silver was nearly gone, but it had done what they needed it to do. It had bought them time and land and a chance. In January, the weather turned cold and damp, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones and wouldn't leave. Gideon spent his days at the mill, coming home with sawdust in his hair and splinters in his hands. Lydia worked the garden, turning the soil, planting greens and onions and early peas. She also began taking in mending from families in town, stitching torn shirts and patching trousers by lamplight. The work was slow and her eyes ached, but it brought in a few coins each week, and every coin mattered. One evening in late February, Gideon came home with news. Thibault had offered him a partnership in the mill, a small share in exchange for labor and a portion of the profits. It wasn't much, but it was steady, and it meant they wouldn't have to worry about work drying up. Lydia felt a surge of relief so strong it nearly brought her to tears. "Take it," she said. "We'll make it work." Gideon nodded, his face serious. "It's a good offer. Fair. And it means we're not just surviving anymore. We're building something." That night, they sat together on the porch, wrapped in a quilt, watching the stars come out over the water. The swamp was quiet, the air cool and still. Lydia leaned her head against Gideon's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't found it?" she asked. "The safe, I mean." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Every day," he said. "But we did find it, and we didn't waste it. That's what matters." She nodded, her hand resting over his. They had been given a gift, a second chance, and they had used it wisely. By spring of 1891, the Hale homestead had become a landmark along the basin's edge. The raised cypress house stood firm and dry, its wide porch overlooking the water, its roof tight against the rain. The garden flourished in the rich soil they'd hauled up from the lowlands, and the chickens thrived in their elevated coop. Gideon had built a small dock where traders and trappers stopped to rest, and Lydia kept a pot of coffee warm for travelers who needed a kind word and a safe place to pause. The land notes they'd found in the safe had been honored, giving them clear title to 40 acres of high ground just beyond the swamp. They'd sold half of it to a young family from Baton Rouge, using the proceeds to buy lumber, tools, and seed. The rest they kept, planning to plant an orchard when the time was right. The jeweled compass sat on the mantel, polished and gleaming, a reminder of the river boat that had carried it and the lives that had been lost. Lydia had researched its history and learned it had belonged to a steamboat captain who'd gone down with his ship in 1872. She'd written to his surviving daughter in New Orleans, offering to return it. The woman had written back, thanking her, but insisting they keep it. "It found you when you needed it most," she'd said. "That's what my father would have wanted." Gideon often stood on the porch in the evenings, looking out over the swamp that had nearly broken them. It no longer felt like an enemy. It was simply part of the land, wild and unpredictable, but also generous in its own way. It had given them fish, game, and timber, and it had given them the safe. Lydia joined him one evening, slipping her hand into his. "Do you ever regret staying?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not once." She smiled, leaning into him. They had come to Louisiana with nothing but hope and determination. They had faced hunger, exhaustion, and despair. But they had also found something rare, a partnership built on trust, patience, and unwavering loyalty. The swamp had tested them, and they had passed. As the sun set over the basin, painting the water gold and crimson, Gideon pulled Lydia close. "We made it," he said quietly. She nodded, her heart full. "We did." And in that moment, standing together on the land they had fought so hard to claim, they knew they had built something that would last.